Good morning. I am so thrilled to see all of you here on this August morning, and hope that you will find the information that we're presenting today as useful and helpful in our thinking about the way forward, as I am. I'm Anita Schmidt. I know lots of you, but there are a few faces that are not familiar to me. I'd love to meet you. Together with Brian Roberson, we are welcoming and implementing this part of the plan for this fall. We have a whole committee who's been working all summer long to make sure that West End is on top of what's getting ready to happen in the special session. So I'm not going to say any more, but I want you to welcome our speakers today, and especially our first one, Carol Cavendell.
Welcome, everyone. This is a great turnout, I think. Can't see you because the light's in my eyes. But my role this morning is to lay out for you, in a very quick way, where we are as a denomination, the United Methodist Church, on issues of LGBTQ inclusion and sort of how we got there and where we are now. And then to talk a little bit about what February's General Conference is all about. And we have been praying and thinking about how we as a congregation need to be intentional and prayerful during this season, because whatever happens in our denomination affects us. And so we want everybody to be informed. And then as others speak, we also want to have conversations together and listen together. So let me just jump in. Most of these slides are, I want to give credit to the Methodist House in Memphis, that I got much of this information from them. So I'm just going to, the United Methodist Church as a denomination as we are now was officially formed in 1968. You may know some of the history of the Methodist Church splitting north and south, and in 1968 we united with the Evangelical United Brethren denomination. And that was the first time that this new denomination began to write down social principles. So we have a lot of social principles. I mentioned this morning our stance against the death penalty is one of our social principles. They are not binding. You can disagree with that and still be United Methodist, but they do represent the prayerful discernment of the global United Methodist Church. And now I want to move to the next slide. So in 1972, for the very first time, there was language put into our Book of Discipline, our shared doctrine, about, and some of this language will seem outdated to many of us, but this is what it is in the Book of Discipline. And I'm not going to read all of this to you, but basically affirming two things: that people who are homosexual are people of sacred worth and belong in the church. However, the practice of homosexuality, according to this wording, is incompatible with Christian teaching. Already it's a bit ambiguous, and it leads to more ambiguity. In 2016, there was something added to our Book of Discipline. When something needs to be added to the Book of Discipline, it has to be voted on by the whole General Conference, which is a quadrennial global gathering of delegates from all over the world. And in 2016, they added, "We implore families and churches not to reject or condemn lesbian and gay members and friends." In 1984, going back a little bit, the Legislative Committee at General Conference suggested and passed that self-avowed practicing homosexuals, again, old language, but this is what it is, are not to be ordained as clergy in the United Methodist Church. In 1996, it became forbidden for ceremonies that celebrate same-gender unions to be conducted by our ministers or in our churches. In 2016, again, representing some of the back and forth, it was affirmed in the Book of Discipline that everyone has equal rights regardless of sexual orientation. So, an overview, and I think you can see in this overview the division already in the church. All people are of sacred worth and created in God's image. The practice of homosexuality is incompatible with Christian teaching. Equal rights should be given regardless of sexual orientation. Marriage is for a man and a woman. So we have seen over the past 50 years almost a back and forth. It has become very political and ugly at times. Again, these slides are going to be available, and we're going to send out a link, but this goes through a few more of the items in the Book of Discipline. Everybody's welcome, no ordination for LGBTQ persons, no weddings, and no funding for special gay caucuses or special groups. Here is a picture of the United Methodist Church globally today. One of the things that we've seen happening in wonderful ways is the explosion of the United Methodist Church in certain regions of Africa. That has affected this conversation, however, as many of you know, because of many of the cultural norms in Africa. The delegates who come from these African churches often are very clear on not ordaining people who are gay and lesbian or approving of marriages, because in some of their cultures it's considered a crime. And so for the United Methodist Church to have a stance that is so different from their culture puts them at risk and their ministry at risk, many of their delegates would say. And so the combination of a growing number of delegates from Africa and the Philippines and a shrinking number of delegates from the United States and Western Europe, this has led, and you can see the breakdown, it's getting toward 40% of African delegates. This has led to a critical impasse that has been going on for years and years. So, in 2016, at the General Conference that was held in Portland, Oregon, there were over 100 resolutions submitted about human sexuality. I know many of you here, my previous congregation, Belmont and others submitted petitions asking for the language of the Book of Discipline to be changed. There were other petitions asking for the Book of Discipline to become even more clear in standing out against the LGBTQ inclusion. And so the legislative committee had all of these petitions, and I was not there in Oregon, but I understand it got to a very painful point for everyone. And finally, the delegates there voted to cry out to the bishops for help. And here's what they requested. They asked the Council of Bishops to delay a debate on homosexuality, set aside all of the petitions that had been submitted, and name a special commission that would completely examine and possibly recommend revisions to every paragraph in the Book of Discipline related to human sexuality. This was stepping out of the way we normally do things, which is Robert's Rules of Order. Sort of the basic rules of democracy, in a way, is what the United Methodist Church has been using for our decision-making process, and it hasn't been working. There have been winners and losers, winners and losers. So this was a cry for, let's do something different. You can see that it barely passed. 23 votes in favor of doing this. But it passed, and so the bishops established a commission on the way forward, on a way forward it has become. So you can see the breakdown of ordained clergy, laity, several bishops from all over the world, Africa, Philippines, Europe, United States. And they spent months together. Not all at once, but they would meet together for 3 or 4 days at a time throughout, since 2016, prayerfully listening to one another, sharing their stories, sharing their pain. There were people, there was at least one gay man, I think 2 gay men on the commission. There was the head of the Wesley Covenant movement, which is a traditionalist movement, all different perspectives. and they shared life together, they shared their stories together, they prayed together. They considered several different models, and in the interest of time, I'm not going to go into the 3 models that they considered, but what they ended up recommending to the bishops was the one church model, which means that each conference, so we are the Tennessee Annual Conference, which is basically Middle Tennessee, the Board of Ordained Ministry, and the clergy session of each conference, so all the clergy, would be able to decide whether or not to ordain someone who identifies as LGBT or Q. Each pastor would be able to decide whether to perform same-gender weddings, and each local church would make the decision about whether to allow same-gender weddings in the sanctuary and to receive an openly gay pastor. There's a lot about the one church model, and I want to introduce Neil Alexander, who is with us today, who's a titan of United Methodism, who knows a lot more about this one church model than I do, but I don't know if you'd like to just clarify or speak a little more into. No, we're good? Okay. He's so gracious. He is going to stay after this session. For those of you who've already been to church, if you'd like to stay, actually you have my permission if you want to skip church and stay. He's going to stay here and answer questions and be able to go more in depth. And in 2 weeks, on August 19th, I'm going to be available during the Sunday school hour, I'm not sure where yet, to have further conversations. So more on that in a minute. So for those, with this one church model passes, which is a huge if, and we'll get to that, those who feel like they could not participate in same-gender weddings would not be required or forced to do so. The central conferences, which are what we call churches in the regions of Africa, Europe, and the Philippines, could maintain their own policies and standards on ordination and weddings. So we would not be, imposing that on them. The model would essentially make legal what's already happening. There are conferences and pastors and churches in other regions and some locally who are just moving forward, doing weddings, ordaining folks, and it's already happening in many places. So it would basically say, it's okay if that's your context. So again, I'm just sharing information here to prepare us for further conversation, which we'll dive into. In February of 2019, delegates will be returning for a special called General Conference to decide a way forward. What are we going to do? They will have the one church plan in front of them as recommended by the bishops, but there are also other plans that can be and are being submitted to that group. The traditionalist plan, which is don't change anything. In fact, let's make it harder. Let's punish people more severely who break the book of discipline. There are those who want to split in different ways and have different branches. So all of these things are coming before our church in February. And so the question is, what do we do as West End United Methodist Church? What can we do in the meantime, in preparation, all along the way? So I mentioned staying and talking with Neil today. You can come to a Sunday school class on August 19th for further questions, conversations, concerns. Lots of information on the United Methodist website. I've put a link in my Monday meditation, but this is a very helpful video from a pastor in Virginia who kind of just lays out what we look like right now and why. We are going to be having some opportunities for holy conversation and dialogue. And we have ways to sign up today or online on the website. There are people who graciously offered to host these conversations in their homes, some of them at the church. And our hope is that this would be a safe place for you, regardless of your opinion, a safe place for you to share your heart and to be heard and to listen to others. One of the questions, probably the primary question we want to have at the end of those conversations is something like, if the one church model is approved, what would your hope for West End be? What would you want us to do and to be? If it's not approved, and we're left with the same book of discipline that we have today, what would your hope for West End be? Pray and fast. We need to be in prayer together. And if you go to our conference website, tnumc.org, at that link, there's some resources for prayer. There's also an invitation, and I know Tom Lee is doing this, to set your little clock alarm to go off every day at 2:23 in the afternoon, probably, to pray. Just to breathe and to pray, because those are the dates of the conference, February 23rd through 26th, so from 2:23 to 2:26. Many are choosing to fast every day, every week, from Thursday evening to Friday afternoon, which is something John Wesley did. We also have an opportunity, and we can talk about this down the road, to contact our delegates from Tennessee who are going to that general conference. There's an email address if you want to just send them an email as an individual. They will be having listening sessions as a delegation, and we're invited. So the two that are closest to us geographically are October 21st and November 4th. Those are Sundays, and we can go and tell our delegations our thoughts and our heart. So I think that's my last slide. I am now going to invite Brian Robertson to come forward as part of our leadership team.
Hi there. As Carol said, I'm Brian, and I'm part of West End's Way Forward team, and we're very grateful for your attention this morning. There are about 8 of us on that team, so we've been trying hard to get this information to you and hope that we will keep you in touch and that you will strive to be in touch as well. I've been at West End for about 17 years now, and in that time, I've had the honor of representing this congregation at the Tennessee Annual Conference. I've chaired our local outreach team. I've chaired our congregational care ministry area. I'm part of the Sacred Journey Sunday School class, and I've also led several small groups. And this church is very important to me. And I have a very special interest in this way forward, as most of you would know if you know me. As a gay West Ender, I am very grateful for this church's inclusive spirit, and I'm really grateful for that welcome statement that's on our worship bulletin every Sunday and the one that's on our website for the whole world to see. But you in this room should know, and all West Enders should know, that that kind of intentional and public welcome to the gay and lesbian community is rare in Nashville United Methodist churches, and even rarer in the state of Tennessee. So I came to West End after being rejected by other churches, and you welcomed me with open arms, just as I am. Not everyone here supported inclusion, but you welcomed me in. You allowed me to engage in ministry, and you allowed me to reconnect with God. The loving light of Christ connected and transformed my life right here in this congregation. Now, as Carol just mentioned, the international laws that govern this congregation still say that my husband and I are not equal to most of you in this room. They say we're equal, but the laws don't say we're equal. So, I look forward to February with great hope and a little anxiety. But you don't have to be gay or lesbian for the way forward to affect you. As Carol said, this is going to affect every congregation, and it's especially going to affect the jobs of our clergy friends. And even if inclusion is not on your daily radar, or even if inclusion is something you don't even support yourself, we need your help. We need your participation. We need your prayer that God's will be done in this process. Not my will, God's will. Thank you. Tom?
Because I'm not as good as Brian, I have pictures. My name's Tom Lee, and like Brian, it's been my privilege to be a member of this congregation for a long time and to feel that same welcome and love from all of you, and hopefully to be able to share a little bit of that as well. I'm also a lawyer, and I tend to think in terms of decision trees. This, if then that, then what if, and maybe some of you do too, and maybe what you're thinking about all of this process is, so what do we do? And that's a conversation we'll have over the next several weeks and months, but what are the choices that are going to come before us? Brian's exactly right when he says this process is necessarily going to touch all of us, despite what may be for you a desire to stay out of politics. It's eventually going to reach us. A friend of mine in the lobbying business says the reason to be involved with politics is if you don't, politics will be involved with you. It's important to understand this process, I think, so that we can make wise decisions for our church. Our family had the opportunity just a couple of weeks ago to be in Scotland, and I took this picture because I was so struck by the beauty of this setting and of this church building. And I wanted to know something about it, and I began researching it, and by dinner I had realized it's not a church anymore. It's a beautiful building surrounded by a lot of graves. It hasn't been a church for decades. In fact, some people bought it recently and they're turning it into an event hall. You've seen churches like that too. You can drive down Charlotte Pike or over by Vanderbilt or any number of places in town where churches have ceased to be the church. And I think that's the concern that all of us face, is that our church, the United Methodist Church and West End, both continue to be not just a beautiful building and a lovely setting, but the church. So the way forward is actually several ways. As Carol mentioned, the Council of Bishops has recommended one particular path that the Commission on the Way Forward identified. But the Commission identified three paths, actually, two with a great deal of thought, and if you want to read the final report of the Council on Bishops, or from the Council of Bishops, you can. It's about 180 pages. And the Connectional Conference Plan and the One Church Plan receive about 150 of those pages. And then there's a plan called the Traditionalist Plan, which we'll talk about. The decision was made to submit all of these plans to General Conference. And so, in St. Louis, one of several things could happen. Any number of these plans could pass. It seems hard to believe that more than one would. It's also possible that nothing passes. That really has been where we are, and it is where we are at the moment. So it's possible that the whole thing could deadlock. I want to submit to you that any of those results has an impact on us. And just to talk very quickly about why. Carol mentioned the One Church Plan. The idea of this plan is to keep voting to a minimum, to respect in some ways what is already happening, to remove the language that persons who are concerned for inclusion find offensive in the discipline regarding marriage and ordination. There's much more to it than that, but this is essentially what it would do. What would it mean for our church? Well, we could, if we chose, say something affirmative in our wedding policies, for example. We have policies about who can get married here, under what circumstances, even the music. So we could say something in our policies that would probably prompt a conversation here at the church. We would not have it given to us to decide whether our ordained clergy could perform weddings elsewhere. That's up to the clergy under this plan. And as I said, there's no voting required under this plan, but we're going to have a conversation if this passes. And for our clergy, the Tennessee Conference could, if it chose, ordain LGBTQ persons as ordained clergy within the church. That would be a change. It would take a recommendation from the Board of Ministry and in all likelihood a vote. And that won't be, that'll be a challenging process. Pastors who are dissatisfied with the result, whatever that might be of that process, would then have the opportunity to transfer out of the conference if they chose. The connectional conference plan, I'll only say this, it could not be more complicated. It is a way of saying we're going to take the United Methodist Church and completely redo it. So instead of 5 United States jurisdictions, we would replace those with 3 connectional conferences. And well, what would they be like? Well, nobody knows because they're going to write their own book of discipline, each one. The theory is you would have home places for persons of different beliefs, and in that capacity, each church in the denomination could align with any connectional conference. Any conference could align with any connectional conference, in some cases multiple connectional conferences. You could have all sorts of interlocking relationships. We could choose our marriage rules under this plan by deciding which connectional conference we want to affiliate with. And then finally, for our clergy would likewise pick, I want this connectional conference or that connectional conference. And bishops would be obliged under this plan to appoint clergy. We'd still have them. We'd still have annual conferences. And the bishops of those annual conferences would be obliged to appoint clergy based on clergy's affiliation and congregational affiliation with various connectional conferences. As I said, it could not be more complicated. But this plan and the one church plan were both moved forward in some detail, and both, I would say, with impressive scriptural foundation within those 180 pages. There is an effort to say, you know, Jesus did not lay out the United Methodist Church the way we have it now. We can have a United Methodist Church that works in any number of ways, but we want to know that it works consistently with the way we understand Scripture. And so there is a serious effort made in the document, with both plans, to say one's more complicated than the other, but both could function in some way. At the very end of the Way Forward process, and by very end, I mean the next to last meeting, another plan was offered up and said, you need to offer this too. It does not get as much treatment by the Council of Bishops because, frankly, it just didn't have as much time before the commission. They anticipated submitting 2 plans, and this third one came. Now, it requires the least institutional change because it preserves the language in the Book of Discipline as it is, and it's sort of the double down plan. It would do away with painful church trials against clergy and simply go to summary dismissals. Annual conferences would pledge to enforce the present language, and conferences that don't would lose the rights to use the United Methodist name, the logo. We have red lights back here. Thank you, John. The Holy Spirit is flaming behind me. And likewise, clergy who performed same-gender marriages or who were found to be LGBT, they somehow slipped past the Board of Ordained Ministry, then those clergy would face summary surrender of their credentials. And bishops, likewise, would have to take a pledge that they would enforce these standards or they would be required to surrender their role. Last is deadlock. Deadlock would mean we end the General Conference in St. Louis where we began, no changes. And what does that do? Well, that presents its own challenge, as evidenced by all of you being right here, right now. We know the present state's not tenable within the denomination. At annual conference this year, our bishop said, regardless of what happens in St. Louis, there will be turbulence And so what we want to know and I think be thoughtful about and prayerful about, I do have that funny little reminder that pops up on my phone at 2:23 every afternoon that forces me to be thoughtful about this process because it's going to require us to do so. One of the interesting things about the report is you can imagine, based on what you just saw, there was conversation in the process of the Way Forward Commission about, well, what would it look like if someone had to exit? And how could that be gracious? And I think to the council and bishops' credit, they said, no, don't do that just yet. Not time to talk about people exiting, churches exiting, bishops exiting. It's time now to talk about how we discern, how we go forward together. And that's the season we're in today. So those are our ways forward. Those are the kinds of decisions that are likely to come before us based on what happens in St. Louis. And we present all this to you in the hope that as you engage in the ways that we will as a congregation, as you discern your own counsel, your own thoughts, your own hopes, and as you share those, you do so in a context of being aware of what's on the ground in front of us. I know we've got some time left, right? If there are folks who want to engage in questions of Carol or Neil or Brian or any of us about this process and what we want to do next and how we go forward.
I just wanted to say one of the things that I've been so grateful for is that this is a congregation that over 10 years ago had some very intentional conversation and sharing and listening. I think the question at that time in this congregation's history was, do we have a booth at the Pride Parade? And there are several people here who were part of that, the common table that was called, and I can't see anyone, but if you were to stand, anybody who participated in those common table conversations, would you mind standing? If you want to know, if you're newish to the congregation and want to know more about those holy conversations, invite one of them to coffee and hear a little bit more about it. But the decision at that time was unanimous that yes, we want to have this witness at the Pride Parade, that God's love is unconditional for all people. And so this congregation has a history of trusting one another and loving one another enough to dive into hard conversations. So I want to issue that invitation, especially if you're newer to the church, that the DNA is already here, and those who are putting together these conversation groups are very intentional about having it be a safe, inclusive space for everyone.